Imagine you're getting ready for a quiet night at home, but suddenly something unexplainable happens. Strange sounds, moving shadows, and situations that make your heart race. In this video, you'll hear true stories from people who have experienced terrifying events they can never forget. Get ready to enter the world of real horror, where reality can be scarier than fiction. I moved to my dad's when I was 10, and I didn't know anyone in the area except for the family my dad was friends with, a single mom with 3 kids. Luckily, there was a girl a couple of years older than me. She was 12 at the time I met her, and we got to know each other a little over a couple of years. We weren't close, but we ended up having the same friends. One night, my friend Rob was hanging out with her and her younger brother. They happened to be in the house alone because their mom was at work. Her mother had been helping this one lady through her work and got to know her fairly well. She found out that the lady's sister was in a mental institution and had been recently let out. The night Rob was hanging out with my friend, they got a knock on the door. My friend thought it was just their mom since she knocks a certain way when coming in, and she answered it without thinking. Rob wasn't supposed to be there, so he took off through the window to his house down the road. He never thought twice about it. But it wasn't her mom. It was the sister of the lady her mom was helping. She had figured out from talking to her sister where the family lived and her mom's working schedule. She came in, and this is where I don't know the details, and I'm glad I don't. My friend's younger brother got away to the neighbor's house to call the police. The lady brutally murdered my friend a week before Christmas, decapitating her and leaving her body naked in a bathtub. She even hit her head. They had to look through the presents to find it. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. This happened to my wife's grandmother about 15 years ago while we were still dating. Her husband had just passed away about a year previously, but she'd been going down to the library and volunteering. She was exercising socialization. This was in the winter, so her walk back was while it was getting dark. The library closed at 5 o'clock, and there was some extra stuff to do before everyone actually left. On this particular night, she turned down a ride from another volunteer because she needed to stay in shape. The house was about a mile away through some lightly wooded area in South Texas, and as she was about halfway home, she noticed someone behind her. He was walking in the same direction and gaining on her, which in itself isn't all that peculiar. She's old and thus not particularly fast. But in this case, he seemed vaguely sinister. They kept walking, and pretty soon he was right behind her. Then he fell into pace, just staying behind her. Now she knew something was up, but she was almost home. She could see the top of her driveway coming up, and she left her lights on so it would look like someone was home when she walked in. She just needed to make it another 150 yards. All that time, she said he was so close that she could feel his breath on her neck. Around maybe 50 yards it happened, a strong hand on her shoulder. "Okay, don't turn around and hand over your purse, or I'll cut you." She stopped for a second, then took one big step forward, turned, and shot the guy in the neck with the .38 she kept in her purse. The guy spent the next 5 years in a prison hospital before he died of complications. My wife's grandmother passed away last year, but up to the end, she lamented that she pulled the trigger too soon. When I was young, I'd say 8 to 11-ish, my sister, who is 7 years older, would babysit when my parents were out. At the time, she smoked a lot, and my parents made her smoke outside, of course. So I'd follow her outside, play around, annoy her, and such. One day, my sister noticed a car at the end of the driveway just sitting in the road. It was a white SUV with a bike rack on top. It had the most tinted windows I'd ever seen. You couldn't see inside from the side. It sat there until she went inside, then would drive to the end of the road and sit at the church parking lot and wait. It would wait until she came out again for another smoke, and it would repeat. This was odd, but my sister is a brave lady and just kind of ignored it. That is until the next day while my parents were out again, and it showed up again. It would sit at the end of the driveway and just watch. I don't know what the driver was doing, but he was watching my sister. I know because if I didn't go out, I'd watch from the front window, and it would just sit there and watch my sister. She told my father, who was a sheriff's deputy at the time, and he called the cops and made a complaint. They showed up, looked around, but the SUV was nowhere to be seen. Months went by with nothing. Then one day, a good 9 months after this had all started, and around 4 months since the last sighting, it was back. It became a regular occurrence. Another day, my sister was outside doing her nasty habit, and sure enough, here it comes. This time, we were all alone as usual, and she decided she'd had enough. She told me to stay in the carport, and she was going to go confront them. She started walking toward the SUV, and halfway down the driveway, she would later remark to us, "I felt a terror like I knew if I went any further, I was dead. I was paralyzed by pure fear." She turned around and went inside. Finally, the family car was in the shop for some kind of issue, so we were all stuck home for the night. While my parents were home, my sister went outside to smoke. I went outside with her, and eventually the SUV showed up. She told me to run inside and tell my father, and I did. My dad promptly got his gun and started briskly walking down the driveway with it in hand in the direction of the SUV, but not leveled toward it. The SUV floored it down the road and peeled out onto the nearby large highway. My dad, being a cop, noted the year, model, and distinguishing features. The scariest thing? The license plate had been covered in duct tape. We never saw it again. I was just 4 or 5 years old and my parents had just separated. My mom was living in a 2-bedroom apartment. I had my own room, but I preferred to sleep in her bed whenever I was staying with her. Our 2 bedrooms were at the end of the hallway, directly across from each other. Our apartment was on the first floor, and I remember that it was in the middle of the summer, and my mom had a window open in her room, which was directly behind the bed above the headboard. Anyways, I woke up in the middle of the night and remember sitting up and seeing that our cat was sitting in the doorframe of my mom's room. I should note her door was open, and you could partially see into my bedroom. This was strange because our cat was typically always in bed with us. As I was watching him, he walked into my bedroom and meowed. I turned to face my mom and woke her up. In the 3 or 4 seconds it took me to wake her up and tell her what was wrong, we both looked back up at the doorframe, and there was a man standing by my open door, making his way out of the bedroom. I still don't know how she managed to do it so quickly, but my mother proceeded to pick me up and literally throw me out of the screen window. She quickly followed, and we were able to start screaming for help, and someone called 911. The police came but didn't see any signs of forced entry, only that our front door was unlocked, which led them to believe that the man must have exited that way. The strange thing was that my mom swore up and down that she had locked the door that night with the deadbolt and chain lock. About a week later, she was cleaning the kitchen and opened up our water heater closet and found a notebook with names and drawings, as well as a pair of gloves and some gum wrappers. The police were called again, but all they could do was speculate that the man had been in our house and hid until we were asleep. This happened to a friend of mine. She told me about it about a year or so ago. We'll call her Minji. Minji's in her early 20s and works as an English tutor in South Korea. One evening, a few years ago, she was tutoring a high school boy. They were up studying pretty late, and the buses stopped running. Being a long way from his house, the boy asked if he could crash on her floor overnight and get the first bus in the morning. Minji was very reluctant because inviting a teenage male student to stay the night didn't sound like a great idea, but he was begging her, and eventually she relented. They went back into her one-room apartment, and she got into bed while he laid a blanket out on the floor, and they both fell asleep. A few hours later, at maybe 2 a.m., The boy woke Minji up. "I'm really hungry," he said. "Let's go get some food." Minji opened her eyes and looked up at him in disbelief. "Food? Now? It's 2 a.m. Go back to bed." But the student insisted, "No, I'm so hungry. Let's eat something now." She told him that there was some ramen in the kitchen and he could fix himself some. This didn't satisfy him. He didn't want ramen. There was a 24-hour place just down the road. Let's go there. Eventually, after several minutes of persuasion, the boy managed to convince Minji to go with him to the restaurant. They left the apartment and headed out. As soon as they were outside, the boy turned to Minji and said, "I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping there." They called the police, and, of course, the guy was some homeless man. This story doesn't always get the same reaction, but I still think it's terrifying. When I was a young child, maybe around 6 or 7 years old, we lived in a small house near some railroad tracks. One night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was coming from the room next to mine. I heard faint moaning and groaning, like someone was in pain. I was so terrified that I couldn't move. After a few minutes, the sound seemed to fade away. In the morning, I told my mom about what I had heard, but she assured me that I must have been dreaming or just heard the wind. I wasn't so sure, but I tried to forget about it. One summer evening, a group of friends and I decided to go camping in a remote forest. The place was known for being eerie, but we brushed it off as just stories. As the night fell, we set up our campfire and started sharing ghost stories, trying to outdo each other with scary tales. Suddenly, we heard rustling in the bushes nearby. We all went silent, listening intently, but then the noise stopped. We laughed it off, assuming it was just a small animal. But later that night, as we were trying to sleep in our tents, we heard footsteps circling our campsite. No one wanted to admit they were scared, so we stayed quiet, hoping it would go away. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a blood-curdling scream echo through the trees. We bolted out of our tents, grabbed whatever we could, and ran for the car. We never found out what made that scream, but we never went back to that forest again. It was a quiet evening, and I was home alone, watching TV. My parents had gone out for the night, so I was just relaxing. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud coming from the basement. At first, I thought it might just be something falling over, but then I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more deliberate. My heart started racing as I realized someone or something might be down there. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a baseball bat, and slowly made my way to the basement door. I could hear the sound of something moving around down there. With my heart pounding in my chest, I opened the door and flipped the light switch. To my horror, the light didn't come on. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity before I finally slammed the door shut and bolted it. I spent the rest of the night locked in my room until my parents came home. They checked the basement, but there was nothing there. To this day, I don't know what I heard, but I've never felt comfortable in that house since. This happened to my uncle when he was a teenager. He and his friends used to go hiking in a remote area with lots of caves. One day, they decided to explore a cave they hadn't been in before. It was deeper and darker than the others they had visited, but they had flashlights and decided to go for it. As they made their way deeper into the cave, they started to notice strange carvings on the walls. At first, they thought it was just graffiti, but the symbols were unlike anything they had ever seen before. Then, they heard a distant sound like a low hum or chant echoing through the tunnels. Thinking it was just the wind, they kept going, but the sound grew louder and more distinct. Eventually, they reached a large chamber deep inside the cave. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols, and in the center of the chamber was a pile of old, tattered clothing. Suddenly, their flashlights started to flicker, and the humming turned into a whispering that seemed to come from all directions. Terrified, they turned to leave, but as they did, one of their friends let out a scream. They turned to see a shadowy figure standing at the entrance to the chamber. They ran as fast as they could, not stopping until they were back in daylight. They never talked about what happened in that cave again, and they never went back.